Okay, so today, folks, I am going to talk to you guys about two separate components, um, but that are kind of interlinked together. And sometimes they're interlinked in a positive way, and sometimes they're interlinked in a way in which there can be quite a lot of kind of contradictory information or even contradictory physiology, which we can kind of, with a little bit of clever programming, trick our way around. So we're going to break this into three parts, really. The first part, and very short parts as well. The first part, I'm going to talk about what strength development is, what makes us strong. And then the second part, I'm going to talk a bit about aesthetics. And aesthetics is a very, I guess, subjective thing. We've all got a different version of what aesthetics are. So we can take the aesthetics to as any extreme as we want within reason and be healthy. And I'm going to talk about when that healthiness stops. And then the third thing I'm going to talk about then is, well, where does the balance between strength and aesthetic come from? So before we get into this, I want to define the terms really clearly. So when I'm talking about strength here, I'm talking about maximal strength, being as strong as we physically can. Now, there will always be an interplay between strength and aesthetics, and that will become clear. When I'm talking about aesthetics, what I'm fundamentally talking about here is maintaining a healthy to lower level of body fat when most people would consider having like an athletic physique. Everybody's got a different level they want to push that to, of course. What I'm going to talk about is my sort of vision of like a typical athlete physique. And again, once we get onto that section, I'll define those characteristics a little bit more carefully. So at a minimum, what we're looking at is like a lean, athletic, toned physique, as people would describe it. And I'll talk a little bit about toning and what that really means. So without further ado, let's talk about strength. What makes us actually strong? Okay. So there's four components to strength, really. Well, and they're interlinked. So the first one is we have a nervous system response. We have a learned motor response to be strong. And that comes down to several different things. One, it's to do with like purely the neural drive from our brain to our muscles that allows our muscles to contract. And strength training, so, lifting weights, allows us to create these adaptations in our nerves and increases the rate at which we can kind of fire those nerves into our muscles, which allows those muscles to contract really, really hard and generate more force. So when we're talking about strength, what we're talking about here is maximum force production in the muscle. So as much as we can lift. The next component, which is kind of neuromuscular, is this idea of improved coordination, technique, right? Fundamentally, if we want to get better at being strong, strength is also movement specific. So just because someone's a really strong bench presser and might have really strong legs on a leg press doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have a really strong squat unless they've got the coordinated movement patterns to do that. Similar, even if someone's a really big, strong powerlifting athlete, yes, there's going to be more transference of skill into something like strongman, but until they've got the specific strongman skill, then it's going to be difficult to sort of transfer that over without the time to do the sort of neuromuscular programming and the improved coordination and stuff as well. So quite a lot of the gains in strength that a lot of new lifters will get will be this neuromuscular these neuromuscular kind of neural coordination adaptations, because these can occur quite quickly. They occur almost immediately during the workout. Your ability to absorb information, learn technique, and even the physiological adaptations happen almost immediately. So when we talk about this idea of noob games, that's really what we're talking about. On a deeper and more complex level, we've got this thing called antagonist co-activation. So I'm going to tell you what that is really simply. I'm not going to get too detailed in the science of this. If you want to understand more about muscle strength, physiology at a deeper level, there's a guy called Chris Beardsley. I think he's on Instagram as Chris A. Beardsley. He owns Strength and Conditioning Research Review.com or Strength and Conditioning Research.com. I can't remember which, but he talks about this from like a studies perspective and all the detailed stuff. So he's a big inspiration for some of the things we're going to talk about, for me to talk about today. Very good research reviewer. And basically breaking stuff down into nice, pretty infographics that are quite complex, but hopefully understandable. So when we're talking about antagonist co-activation, what we're talking about, so if I'm doing a bicep curl, I'm going to flex my biceps now. If I'm doing a bicep curl, this is my agonist. So this is the one doing the movement, right? As I'm performing a bicep curl or a squat or whatever it is, my quads are doing the movement or my biceps are doing the movement in a bicep curl, that I've got some activation of my triceps, which counteracts this force production here, which limits the amount of force that my biceps can produce. Now that happens for a number of different reasons: joint protection, to reduce joint torques, to slow the movement down so we don't snap tendons off the bone, so on and so forth. But what happens with experience with strength training is we get a reduction in that antagonist, so the opposite muscle activation. So part of the strength gain that we get is related to this ability to not just fully recruit a muscle, and we get that development as well, which is the increased motor unit recruitment. So a motor unit is just a nerve into a muscle, and that's your motor unit. It's the muscle fibers that one nerve cell innervates. So you've got muscles from your brain down your spine into your muscles. We think about contracting a muscle, the muscle contracts. Each one of those nerves will contract multiple muscle fibers, okay? And with time and experience, we get this, and training, we get this improved motor unit recruitment, it's called. So we get more units recruited, and they can recruit more rapidly and with more levels of intensity, so more levels of activation. So that's the kind of neuromuscular component to it. So it's those three things: improved coordination, sort of motor learning skill, reduced antagonist coactivation. So the muscles that are actually doing the lifting aren't fighting against the muscles on the opposite side of the body. And then increased motor unit recruitment, which basically means that the neural drive, if you want to call it that, and the amount of activation that those nerves can elicit within a muscle fiber, which then spreads throughout the muscle, is greater. And these are all caused by adaptations that are caused by strength training, right? The stimulus for these adaptations are coordinated movements, movements that actually involve lower levels of antagonist coactivation. So trying to not do too many movements which have the requirement for those to be there. And then the other big element of this as well, in terms of training performance, is this idea of like fatigue around that and how much fatigue influences these things, which I'm going to talk about a little bit in the second component, because this comes down to the programming. So as well as our neuromuscular, so the brain coordination, activation of various muscle groups, the other component which is important for strength development is muscle size, but not just muscle size. We've got muscle size. We've also got so muscle size, muscle hypertrophy, so the growth of a muscle. But we also have this idea of other things within the muscle as well. Without getting too much depth into it, we have things like what's called lateral force transmission, right? So this sounds really crazy. So in our muscle, we've got these things called sarcomeres, which are muscle fibers that line up end to end to end. And basically, with strength training, we get better transmission from one sarcomere, one muscle fiber, into the next one. And that creates more force production across the course of the muscle. So when we think about strength training, strength isn't the adaptation. Strength is the summation of several different adaptations. And one of those other adaptations we get from strength training, which is structural, if we think about some being like kind of nervous system drive, coordination, motor patterns, and the structural being the muscle growth and the capacity of the muscle fibers themselves to transmit force. The other side of that is increased tendon stiffness as well. So strength training makes us have stiffer tendons. So if you imagine trying to push something, the difference between pushing something with like an elastic band versus a rubber, the stiffer a tendon and the more pull a tendon has, the less slack there is, the more transmission there is from the muscles into the tendon unit. Okay. The more force we have transmitted, the more efficient the movement. Sorry, not more efficient the movement. I guess more efficient is the right term. The more effective the forces that the muscles generate, the muscle fibers generate, are transmitted to the bones, because we have muscle, tendon, bone. Obviously, the muscle contracts, pulls on the tendon, moves the bone. If we have greater stiffness, we have less slack in the tendon. Basically, we get greater force transmission, which means that all that nice, strong muscle fiber that we have isn't then just being lost into these flimsy elastic tendons. Okay. So in terms of training for that, we know that if we're thinking about whether it's the good thing about this is we don't have to train. Sorry, someone in the waiting room. The good thing about this is we don't have to train like loads of different components of these things. Now, there are things where you can kind of switch your training out to target all of these different components, whether it's the technique stuff. So obviously with technique stuff, when do we want to do that if we're trying to learn a new technique? We want to do technique stuff if it's particularly if it's a technical lift. So for example, me and you, Emma, we did some Olympic lifting, right? We don't start with technical lifts doing really heavy weights. We start with them light. Why? It's not just because we're not strong enough to lift them. It's because technically, when we're doing technical stuff, we don't want to be doing technical work in a fatigue state, right? So we want to do our technical work at the start of a session to improve our coordination. And we want to do that at the, sorry, 1 second. It's getting a random, okay, we're all good. We're all good. Yes, we want to do those things with in it. Sorry, I'm just getting some messages through here. Apologies. Yeah, so we want to do those things during, not during the workout. Of course, we want to do those things during the workout. We want to do those things when we're in a non-fatigued state. So if we've got any technical development to do, that isn't about lifting light to failure. If we're going to do technical work, we still want to move with intent. We still want to recruit the right muscles, but we want to be doing that if it's particularly technical. So like Olympic lift snatches, or even like a squat's a fairly technical lift if you're not used to it, or you've got some imbalances in your body and you're not used to squatting, or balance issues in your body, and you're not used to squatting. Those are very technical lifts if we're not used to it. So you always want to do the technical elements with in a low fatigue state. And yes, with time, then you want to then make sure that you are, then you can build up the loads once the technique is nailed down. But that still doesn't mean that we then can't strength train and do accessory real heavy work with movements that we have got more motor skill on. So for example, it's pretty easy to see that like a back squat would have a really big carryover to an Olympic lifting movement. A deadlift would have a massive carryover to the sort of clean or the jerk in Olympic lifting because you're pulling off the floor really aggressively, right? So the deadlift has carryover, but you would never put the same load on a deadlift or even a comparative percentage load if you'd never, that you could lift onto a snatch, for example, if you'd never done snatch work before, or you'd never do the same with a clean or a jerk movement, unless you had what's the word? Unless you had some previous experience coaching with that. Sorry, I'm a bit distracted because I'm getting messages through of like people trying to get on, and I'm like, I've sent the link. The link should be there. But yeah, sorry guys. So when it comes to the other stuff though, the other stuff really is about, well, what kind of loads and rep ranges are we looking at training to develop strength? And the cool thing about strength is it's really simple. You've got two numbers to really remember, and that's 35. Well, two numbers, 3 and 5. So you're going to do 3 to 5 sets, 3 to 5 reps with 3 to 5 minutes rest in between. Now we're talking about strength here, right? One of the components that I've just discussed there is about, to get stronger, we need bigger muscles. Now, strength and hypertrophy are overlapping on a continuum. So if you think of strength and muscle growth as being on the same continuum, they're on the same continuum, but there's a slight overlap. And that overlap occurs at around about the 5 or 6 rep range, okay? So if you feel like you want to get all of the neuromuscular benefits from lifting heavy, right? So all of that kind of maximum force production, all of that sort of neural drive, then that's where you're going to want to be doing your heavier work, your sort of 1 to 3 rep ranges. That would be pure strength. The reason I say 3 to 5 is because, one, I'm not talking from an elite and advanced level here. I'm talking like a beginner level. And typically speaking, and this ties in really with the aesthetic component, is that, be doing big, heavy singles and taking like 5 minutes rest in between sets. People aren't going to get a lot of volume of work done. They're not going to get a lot of the hypertrophy benefits. And for most people's aesthetics, what they actually want to do is build a little bit of muscle growth muscle as well. Okay. So if you're not interested in building muscle, anywhere between 1 and 5 reps is really where you want to stay. If you're interested in building muscle, 3 to 5, just strengthen a little muscle, anywhere between 3 and 15 reps, but you want to concentrate around that 5 rep mark there, because 5 is where the sort of crossover is between pure strength and strength and hypertrophy. It's where, if we imagine that graded spectrum from pure strength to muscle growth, that 5 rep range is roughly where is a good sweet spot to be for people who want to build muscle and also want to get strong as well. It's where the kind of, the trade-off would be, shall we say. If you're just interested in pure strength, training 1 to 3, 1 to 5 reps would be fine. I tend to train, like a 5-3-1 system. So I'm doing some heavy single work, some triples and some 5s. Now, one of the things I would say with this in terms of training as well is then we've got 3 to 5 sets. One of the things I would say in terms of training as well is that for strength training, if we are going to go heavy-ish, like to the point where we're doing a true sort of close to 1 rep max, or a close to 3 rep max, or a close to 5 rep max, in order to maintain that level of output. And remember, the point of trying to do strength training is to stay strong. It's not to elicit fatigue. We need enough recovery in between our sets so that when we then go back and do another strength exercise, another exercise or another set of the same exercise, that we are strong enough to then maintain that output, okay? So fatigue will fatigue will typically accumulate across a strength training session. But one of the things that you will find is if you ever watched an Olympic weightlifter in training or a pure powerlifter in training, their sessions will take forever. They will do a set and they will wait like 5, 6, 7 minutes. So they're fully recovered or as recovered as they can be before they then do the next set. Because what they're interested in is maintaining maximal force output. And that's the point, right? The point of strength training is to elicit the adaptation. And that adaptation is maximum force production, which means you can't just do a set of 5, take a minute's rest, and then do another set of 5. You're not going to be able to do it. Or you're not going to be able to do it with the same level of intensity and motor unit recruitment, which then creates this overall strength adaptation. So we have to be patient if we're trying to develop strength. Now, this can be at loggerheads for people from an aesthetic perspective. I don't want to get too much into this for obvious reasons. If people have only got 1 hour a day to train, let's say they're busy people and they're getting the general activity up to lose a bit of body fat, but they really want to maximize their output in a training session. If you think about that, if I was to do like a squat session and I was to do 5 sets of 3 repetitions with 5 minutes rest in between each set, that's 30 minutes with the working sets as well. So you've got 5 sets with 5 minutes rest in between. That's 25 minutes without the working sets. So you're looking at half an hour to do one exercise, right? With very low output and lots of rest periods. So this is one of the crossover elements we get between aesthetics and strength, is that we might need to sacrifice a little bit of strength training to get some training volume in there, or it might even be the training volume is switching towards cardio-based stuff just to increase our energy expenditure. If we have a fairly sedentary day, that might be a priority. Again, we'll talk about aesthetics in a little while. And then that's it, really. You know, you want to stick to multi-joint compound movements, squat, deadlift, benches, but only once you have the reason I talked about the coordination and the technique thing first is because without good technique and good coordination, we're just going to get ourselves injured. Now, one of the things I would say is if you're not competing in powerlifting or a pure strength sport, I would try and keep things in the, sorry, 1 second. I'm having some internet connection issues. Emma, can you still hear me okay there? Sorry, am I still good? Am I dropping in and out or am I okay? Oh, am I back? Sorry, 1 sec, guys. Hang on. Let me just switch my internet over. Let's see if I can do this. I hate this when I'm trying to do live stuff that I know is going to go on like YouTube later on. It's not so bad when it's live. It's just when it's just then when you're you got to upload it on YouTube. It's like if anyone's watching this back on replay, just fast forward a minute or so. Right, give me 1 second. Sorry, I'm just switching my internet over. Right, let's try this one. Right, am I back, Emma? Just give me 1 sec. Right, sorry about that, guys. It might drop again in a second, but I've got one more try on this. So completely lost my train of thought now. Anyway, training wise. So what I would say is with this as well, and this comes in with the aesthetic part, what we don't want to do is be causing like loads and loads and loads of fatigue with our strength training, because we're not going to be able to, because ultimately we're going to have this balance with fatigue with a lower calorie diet. So why would we have a lower calorie diet? Because we want to lose weight, because we want to lose some body fat, because that's what our perception of aesthetics might be. So you don't need to be, when I say you're training these rep ranges of like 3 to 5 reps, I don't really necessarily prescribe doing really heavy singles or doubles, 1s or 2s for people who aren't necessarily powerlifters. I just think it's an unnecessary evil. Mentally, it's difficult to psych yourself up for, particularly if you're dieting and all that kind of stuff as well. So I would say 3 to 5 rep ranges, closer to the 5 rep range, but you don't need to be, you don't necessarily need to be like grinding out that 5th rep. Do you know what I mean? If the 4th and 5th one are fairly difficult, like it's like an 8, 9 out of 10 effort, you're probably doing okay. Now, this is a benefit because what it will do is, one, it will allow you to progress your load week on week on week a little bit easier, because you're not just beating yourself up, and you're not going to generate so much fatigue. One of the things I would say, though, is when you look at a total session, so let's say I just said there 3 to 5 sets per exercise, right? Over an entire session, I would say for strength work, if you're going to be doing multiple strength sessions a week, so a good strength split might be you do a bench press session on a Monday with some accessories, a deadlift session on a Wednesday with some accessories, and then a squat session on a Friday with some accessories, right? Basically, you don't really want to be doing more than like maybe 10 to 12 sets, I would say, as in any workout. So even if you were doing, say, 5 sets of bench, right? If you're doing 5 sets of bench, you might do 7 sets of a combination of other exercises. So you might do 2 sets of incline bench press, you might do 2 sets of decline bench press, or 2 sets of close grip press to make your other sort of 6 to 7 sets up, okay? The reason for that is because you're going to accumulate fatigue. And I know it's the upper body, it's not the same, but you will get an accumulation of fatigue, especially if you're training close to failure. You'll get an accumulation of fatigue in your sort of central nervous system stuff, which isn't peripheral. So peripheral being the muscles and the stuff that happens in your muscles, muscle damage and things like that, accumulation of metabolites in the muscle. You will get this kind of central carryover fatigue, which means that typically speaking, the more muscle groups that you've got recruited into a movement. So like a squat and a deadlift would cause more central fatigue than a bench press, right? Just a lot bigger muscle groups in a squat and a deadlift. Heavier weights, more muscles being activated there. And what you don't want then to happen is it to just be a case of like hammering each session. So what I would always say is start with a really simple training frequency of like 2 to 3 times a week. Stick with that, progress the loads or progress the sets, whichever you prefer. So maybe start with 3 sets, then go to 4 sets, then go to 5 sets, then go back to 3 sets and progress the load. So you're just making these really small increments in either load or number of sets on a week-to-week basis within that rep range, because we want to stay in that rep range if we want to get damn strong. The question would become then is, when do we step outside that rep range? And that's not an obvious one. That would be if we wanted to specifically really focus in on that hypertrophy. And in hypertrophy, I would always prescribe, so just pure muscle growth. If that's what's our limiting factor in strength, is I would always say anywhere between 5 and 15 repetitions. Scientifically, it's anywhere between 5 and 30 repetitions, but doing 30 rep sets takes a hell of a lot of time. And actually, we still need to keep this idea of being 1 or 2 reps from failure in there. So we don't need to be at failure, but we want to try and think of the difference between trying to do a set of 8 reps on an exercise and being close to failure versus 30 reps and being close to failure. So that means you're only really getting fatigued at like reps 25, 26, 27. If you've had a tough day at work or you're tired from dieting, hint, hint, this is where this might come in terms of what's limiting in terms of strength development and muscle size, the chances are you're not going to get as much out of your workouts. Now, I do include a lot of sort of 10 to 15 rep sets, even in my strength workouts. 2 reasons. One, because it's acceptable to do so. And on certain muscles where I might have, let's say I've got a little niggle or an injury, I can't go too heavy, particularly with isolation work. So if you've got any kind of like joint pains and stuff, going a little bit lighter, but to higher reps, when it's not a specific like overload of just lifting a heavy weight, is kind of one reason why I might do it, for a little bit of self-preservation. And the second reason I'll do it is because for certain muscle groups, particularly isolated muscle groups, so for like, say, biceps, triceps, if you're doing them in isolation, rear deltoids, lateral raises, I think that there's some benefit in going a little bit lighter, just because it allows you to isolate the muscles a little bit more better and stop the other bigger muscle groups coming in. And it allows you to have a more controlled muscle contraction as well. So when we're trying to talk about hypertrophy in that sense, when we're trying to target specific muscles for aesthetics and to develop muscle size that can then be transferred into strength, there's nothing wrong with going a little bit lighter, because we can still develop hypertrophy. We're just not going to get that same level of neural drive that we do from going heavy training. Okay. So that's where the crossover is. That's where the difference is. Pure strength is more neural and technique based. And yes, muscles involved with that. Your muscles are going to produce the force. Whereas if we're talking about hypertrophy strength, we're talking about development of muscle size with strength. But that also means that if we just go onto a pure bodybuilding program, we never see less than 5 reps. We will still get stronger, just our maximum strength won't get as high as if we did heavier stuff as well, right? Does that make sense? We will still get stronger, but you're not going to maximize your potential. So don't forget, there's a difference between progressing something and maximizing something, right? That's an important concept and thread to get through this entire little workshop, because we can get lean, build muscle, we can get lean and get strong, but are we really going to maximize our strength? The answer to that will become clear when I move on to this next little truck image that you can see here, okay? So the other component about strength, and this is something that you'll be familiar with if you ever watched World's Strongest Man, is that there's an element of mass moves mass, right? The bigger you are, the more, if you've got a certain amount of force and you have more mass and you can maintain a certain amount of, acceleration and generation of movement and muscle contraction velocity, you will move more weight, right? There's a reason why guys like Eddie Hall are the size they are. And when they get leaner, they're still damn strong. Let's not make any mistake about it. But, you need to be able to put your weight into the bar is a good way of thinking about it. Sorry, 1 second. Just another internet issue here. I'm going to swap over. I might drop for a second. Sorry, switching hotspots. Switching hotspots. Right. Okay, I'm back there, Emma. Sorry, you're my guinea pig for this one. So when we talk about strength, there's obviously we can build more mass by building more muscle. Great, that might be from an aesthetic perspective of what we would call good mass gain, right? We build more muscle again to a certain point, to a certain extent, but then also there comes a point at which just having extra body fat is going to be important for different reasons. And again, we'll talk about that in the aesthetic component. So let's move on to aesthetics really quickly. So the fundamental components of aesthetics is everyone's got an ideal amount of muscle that they want to build. So they might want to look like a CrossFitter, they might want to look like a gymnast, they might want to look like an Olympic weightlifter, like a swimmer, okay? The amount of time and effort you will need to put into your strength training and hypertrophy training to achieve that will be determined by what the end goal is. And then on top of that as well, there's always going to be a genetic component to it. There's always going to be like an age component to it as well. And there's always going to be an overall lifestyle component in terms of that, you know, if you can't eat well, if you can't sleep correctly, if you're not providing the body with the right nutrients, enough protein, the right amount of energy for training, and everything's in place to maximize your natural potential, most people will never, I think most people never really reach their genetic potential in terms of muscle growth for two reasons. One, because they progress their training too quickly when they're younger. Instead of like, you know, they're trying to rush to build as much as possible, and they end up doing these really high volume training programs. And therefore there's like, you basically just hit a ceiling really quickly. So then to grow muscle, it just becomes harder and harder and harder. And then, you know, your body's very not fatigue resistant. Your body becomes very training resistant. So there's some evidence to suggest that if you've trained for like 3 or 4 months consistently, taking a few weeks can kind of resensitize the muscle to muscle growth rather than just keep pounding on more and more and more. So there's some evidence for that. It's an emerging field, but there is some research around that might suggest that if you're doing a muscle building program, you might do 5 or 6 weeks, take a couple of weeks off, not to completely detrain, but you just kind of just do some fluff basically. And then you go back in and you resensitize the muscle to a hypertrophy stimulus. So the muscle growth component then is one element of aesthetics. The second component to that then is obviously, I've put it as a scale here, but because it's the only little emoji, it's not emoji. The only little icon I could find which was sort of similar is body fat percentage, right? When we think aesthetics, we think body fat percentage. Now, this is a really important one because if you think about the links, and this is why I've drawn some pretty little arrows here, okay? So if you think about the links between body fat and size here, the heavier we are, there's only so much muscle growth we can get, right? Muscle growth is a very finite thing. It becomes increasingly difficult to keep building muscle past a certain point, unless we're using, you know, we decide to throw some, you know, performance enhancing drugs in the mix, which, you know, most of us aren't going to do, let's be honest, right? So there comes a point at which if we are already strong, let's just say, if we're already strong and we've got an amount of body fat and we start to reduce body fat, our strength might actually drop, okay? Because we just don't have the amount of mass to put behind the bar, if you want to call it that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that our muscles have got weaker. It's just that mass moves mass to a certain extent. So our relative strength might go up. And this is the difference between absolute strength and relative strength. So when we talk about strength, in what sense are we trying to get stronger? So for example, I am relatively stronger now than I was when I was at my absolute strongest, okay? So it's what's most important. So relative strength is basically what you can lift divided by your body weight, right? So if I was 120 kilos bench pressing 160 kilos, you do 160 divided by 120, which is 1.4-ish. Someone check my maths for me there. I'm not got my calculator with me. Whereas if I was to do, say, 140 kilos at 80 kilos, that's a much higher ratio. That's like 1.7. I don't know. Someone do the maths. But anyway, on a per grams per kilogram basis of lifting, my relative strength is higher, even though my absolute strength, what I can actually lift, is lower, okay? So it depends what we're aiming at. You know, if you want to get your most absolute strength, the chances are, depending on the movement, i.e. if it's going to be a squat or a bench press or a deadlift, a big multi-joint movement, the chances are that you're going to have to gain some body fat. What's the other advantage of body fat? For example, on a bench press, if you've got more fat mass and you carry it on your shoulders and your chest, your range of motion is smaller, so you can lift more because the range of motion, you have to lift it further. On the other side of it, as we lose fat mass, our range of motion, if we were going to use a pure powerlifting bench press where you touch your chest, what happens? Your range of motion increases, right? Because you've got further to go, because you've got less chest, because there's not a layer of fat on top of your skin. So even though your muscles might maintain the exact same strength, what you can lift gets lower because one, you've got less mass to move it, and two, you're probably going to have to move it through a greater range of motion. And that's true of actually most of the lifts as well. You might not think that really applies to not so much the deadlift, I guess. But even with a deadlift, if you've got a lot of fat behind the bar and you can lean backwards, you're putting weight to counterbalance the weight in front of you. So it kind of helps there as well. Don't want to turn this into a biomechanics workshop because that's a thing all of its own accord. But fundamentally, that's one thing where if our body fat's going to get to a certain level, then we're going to limit our strength. Now, what I'm going to talk about here is relative strength, because that's what I think most people are interested in, being as strong as they can whilst they've got their aesthetic goal or visual in mind, right? That's what we're really about. So the training still holds true for that. It's just that the question then becomes, are we losing strength because we're losing fat mass, or are we losing strength because we're doing something a little bit silly in terms of our attempts and our effort, in terms of how we're losing that fat mass? And that's the last thing I want to talk about today, really. So the final thing really then is not the final thing. The final thing on this part really is, this idea of, if we're going to lose weight, I'm not going to get into, if anyone doesn't understand calories in, calories out, energy balance type stuff. Basically, we need to be consuming less calories than we're expending during activity to lose weight. I'm not going to turn it into that or go beyond that at this point, because again, it's a topic within itself, and I've got loads of content out there on that if people want to hunt it down. So if we're in an energy deficit, then the question becomes, can we be in an energy deficit and build muscle? Number one, because that's an component of strength. Can we be in an energy deficit and gain strength? That's the second component, right? So being in an energy deficit, we can build muscle and we can build strength in an energy deficit, right? There is a caveat to that, and that is that the more of an energy deficit that we're in, the more fatigue we generate, right? If we less energy, we have a less chance for recovery from our strength sessions, which is going to limit our strength potential, right? It's going to limit our recovery potential. So when we talked about the neuromuscular adaptations from strength training taking place almost immediately, right? They don't require necessarily a lot of energy to do that. However, the neuromuscular stuff, when it comes to driving the strength to build the muscle and everything else around it, so if we're in a very fatigued state, we're not going to be able to generate that central nervous system, that neural drive is going to affect performance. If we're not stressing the muscle effectively, because we're not lifting the weights we can, because we're fatigued, because we're in too much of an energy deficit, guess what? We're not going to get stronger, okay? At least if we're pushing things too aggressively. And that's to do with things like, for example, if we choose like a low carb diet, carbohydrates aren't necessarily an essential fuel directly for strength training. But if you're in a low carbohydrate strength state or a low blood glucose state, that will have neural effects, mood state, effects on training concentration. And yes, there are some neural things there as well. And remember what I said before about, if we're trying to train purely for aesthetics in terms of muscle growth, we might have some higher rep sets in there. And if we're in a low glycogen state, that is likely to inhibit performance. So if you are going to cut calories and you are interested in maximizing strength, one of the things that I would always encourage people to do is to have some form of carbohydrate, like as part of one of their meals, like in that meal before they train, because that elevation in blood glucose is going to give some cognitive benefits for performance as well. And it may give some performance benefits in terms of just reducing or eliciting some of those central limiters on performance. So our brain's really, really attuned to like blood sugar levels. Like, it's kind of important for us to exist, right? Having blood sugar, like, people have an injection of insulin, they haven't got enough blood sugar, they die if their blood sugar drops too low, right? So maintaining blood sugar levels isn't just about, it's about health and function, but from a performance perspective, if we're not careful, then if we follow a low carb diet, some people will do it fine and they will build muscle. By the way, you can still build muscle on a low carb diet, right? And you can still build strength on a low carb diet. What I'm saying is here, we're trying to maximize strength whilst improving aesthetics. And there is no evidence to suggest that following a low carb diet versus a high carb diet, if calories and protein are matched, is more beneficial for fat loss. So why would we cut one of the potential primary fuels for our central nervous system and our muscles in a dietary approach when we don't need to, right? That just doesn't make sense to me. And again, and just even for just things like food variety, fruits, vegetables, general health, that's why I'm more of an advocate of keeping carbohydrates in the diet, fullness, satiety, all that kind of stuff, big starchy carbs if you are trying to cut weight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about approaches to that in a minute, but I want to talk about this idea of body fat as well. So we might have this aesthetic goal in mind. Now, typically speaking, I would say, and there's always a lot of what I would call like inter-individual variation in this. So just because I'm saying this now doesn't mean that you could or couldn't. What I'm saying is generalizations here. For a guy, you are going to, for a male watching this, you are going to struggle to build muscle and strength at a good rate. I'm not going to say maximally because again, it's individual, but at a good rate. But I still think it's possible. If your body fat is probably less than 10, I would push to 12%. So for me personally, and what I experience with a lot of my athletes and what a lot of the research would say, if I've got an athlete who I want to stay aesthetic, as in fairly lean, not carrying too much body fat, looks good and healthy and strong, but I want them to get stronger, I don't want their body fat getting much lower than 12%. And if it is already, I will try and get them back up to that 12 to 15% range. Okay. What that looks like, there's loads of visual guides out there as well. Don't just, those biometric kind of scales you step on that tell you your body fat. Don't listen to them. There's lots of decent visual guides out there. I should have put one on here, but I didn't think about it until I just started talking about it now. Okay. For women, I would suggest realistically, if a woman's got less than 15% body fat, she's very going to be likely to be very athletic and very lean. And that would be good for like maintaining performance and being like an athlete, like a runner or someone who's a strength athlete who's trying to maintain performance. But if someone's looking to develop strength, I would say like 18 to 20% is where they want to be. That would still be a very healthy looking, aesthetically, what most people would consider like an aesthetically pleasing physique. If I was to talk again in generalizations, some people like more muscle, some people like leaner muscle. What I'm talking about here is practicalities of being able to maintain a body fat percentage which is healthy, because let's not forget, we can gain a load of power by gaining a load of fat mass. Power. We can gain a load of strength in terms of force production, in terms of what we can lift in a bar, at least anyway, by gaining a lot of fat mass. But is that going to have some detriment to our health, joints, blood sugar levels, because we might be pre-diabetic if we push body fat too high, cardiovascular disease, cardiovascular risk. And the reality is that bigger people die younger, whether that's muscle or whether it's fat. Bigger people die younger. It just puts a lot more stress on the internal organs, right? One of the reasons I downsized from being a 120 kilo powerlifter to a 90 odd kilo powerlifter who will flirt with 95 kilos if the mood suits me is because I got sick of getting out of breath walking up hills. I got sick of like testing my blood sugar levels and them being through the floor. So I've been there, seen it, done it, and got many t-shirts when it comes to pushing it up. And don't get me wrong, I was as strong as a bear, but relatively I'm stronger now, and relatively I'm a damn sight a lot healthier, although age takes its toll on us all, like joints wise and things. But I'd put that down to being that size when I was younger has definitely left me with some scars, shall we say, physically, in terms of what I've done to my body because of that. But the exuberance of use, being an extreme person with an extreme characteristics has made me do that. And that's for everyone to make their own decisions on, but just not for me anymore. Right, just give me 1 second whilst I just take a mouthful of fluid. So the question becomes then, if let's say we've got an excessive amount of body fat, so let's say for a woman you're 20-25% body fat, you want to get to an aesthetic. Can you build muscle and strength? Yes, you can. Can you build strength alone? Definitely. Can you build muscle and strength? Yes, you can. The leaner you get, the harder it becomes to definitely build muscle. And the more, like I've said before, for various reasons, if you're not building as much muscle and you've maximized your technical elements of your lifting, your neuromuscular elements of your lifting, your coordination elements, you've got less mass. And also because you're going to then start to get to body fat percentages where your body will, what I call pushback. So you will get more fatigue. Your body will recognize and go, no. We're starting to get to the levels now where we're starting to get to we're in levels where we're starting to dip into what like our essential fat is. So for men, anything less than like 7 or 8% body fat is where they'll notice like a significant, I'm saying they will notice a decrement in performance, but a significant drop off in performance once men get to 7-8%. You might be able to maintain performance at 8 to 12, but for most men, below 8% body fat, their performance is going to drop off a shelf. I guarantee you they will feel like crap. Even if their calories are still high, if they're maintaining maintenance intake, they're not dieting, just being at that body fat percentage. And I would say the same is typical for most women. And again, I'm talking a lot about natural athletes here as well. I'm not talking about people who, use performance enhancing drugs. Okay. And even in that situation there's still a drop off. It might occur at a later stage, or they can compensate by using performance enhancing drugs. But I'm talking generally speaking here. So If we then think about this, and this is what this last little image is here, we've got different approaches to fat loss we can use. And I would suggest that there's no right or wrong way to doing this. It just depends on where you are in your journey. What I would say is if somebody is fairly lean and fairly strong, so this would be the top line here, the very straight line, a linear deficit of a couple of hundred calories a day. So we calculate and estimate our maintenance intake, we track our weight, we track our body fat, we track our strength, we track our performance. So we're looking at our reps and our sets and our loads in the gym. And I'll show you a program in a minute looking at that. So we do all of that stuff and we create a very small amount of deficit. So again, if we think about this idea of there being a relationship between calorie deficit, fatigue, and performance, if we're already quite lean, we don't want big deficits to lose weight quickly because our performance is likely to fall off a cliff quite quickly. So the benefit of that is less energy deficit, less fatigue, more energy to train, and therefore we can usually get a little bit leaner because we're not crashing the body with these extreme deficits with our training. We can also therefore maintain strength output and performance. The problem with this approach is if we're going to use these kind of very subtle slight deficits, maybe 200 to 300 calorie deficits a day, we have to be really on it with our nutrition in terms of accuracy. We can't just start sneaking the extra cookie, the bites, licks, and taste, the BLTs, as I call it, because very quickly we'll be at maintenance, okay? Now, that might not be a problem if you're already lean. It's just one of those things we have to accept that if we're trying to get that more aesthetic lower body fat look, so let's say we're at, for a woman at 20% trying to get down to 15%, or a guy at 15 trying to get down to 10 to 12, which is like what I would call abs lean for a guy and probably similar for a woman. Again, depends on where you store your body fat distribution. It's different for different people, but for the sake of brevity and a nice visual that I'm sure most people can plug into. So that's one approach. The second approach really then is what I would say is something which is, I would say is someone who's carrying a little bit of extra fluff, but isn't overweight, okay? And that is basically you can have like slightly more aggressive deficits with a little diet break, slightly more aggressive deficits with a little diet break. So you might do 3 or 4 weeks, let's say a 500 calorie deficit. Then you'd have 3 or 4 weeks at maintenance. And within that, you're going to create a little bit more fatigue with the deficit, but you are a little bit more fatigue with the deficit, but actually you're getting a little break from it. And the chances are that, you know, again, it depends on the individual and their level of strength training experience. I'm talking like a beginner to intermediate level here. You're not going to drop strength too quickly because you're just getting like, you're aggressive, but not too aggressive, right? And again, the nature of the deficit will obviously then depend on who you are as an individual. Like if someone's a small person who's fairly sedentary, but has got a high amount of fat mass, so like a tiny stature in terms of bone, musculature, height, chances are that you're not going to be able to even elicit a 500 calorie deficit a day if your maintenance is say 1600, right? So you can use an online calculator for this kind of stuff if you need to. It's easy enough to do. So it might not even be feasible for that to be an approach. You might have to take the more pragmatic approach anyway, just because of the look of the draw of where you are. But for blokes in particular, if they've got, say, 25 to 30% body fat, this would be a good approach of being a little bit more aggressive. Do that for 3 or 4 weeks, have a little diet break. And again, women probably, 25 to 30% would be a similar sort of range of body fat where they'd want to do that. The final approach really there, so this is the staggered one. The final approach really, and we get to the same end result, it just might take like a little bit longer. I've drawn my graph a little bit long there. It will take a little bit longer to get there, but again, we're likely to be able to lose the fat a little bit. It take the same amount of time to get there, but we're going to do it a bit more aggressively, which is something that would be body fat dependent, how aggressive we can be, right? If we're already lean, the body's going to kick into that defensive mode of like, we don't want to do this much quicker. The final one would be if someone's got really high percentage body fat. So I'd say for like men over sort of 25, 30% body fat, and for women over 30, 35% body fat, you can get, I'm not saying you have to do this. I'm saying you can get away with more aggressive deficits at the start. Why? From an aesthetic perspective, well, our body's going to thank us for dropping a lot of weight quickly. Our joints, our health, our blood markers, things like that are probably going to improve significantly from losing weight quite rapidly if we can sustain the calorie deficit. Remember, this is all in the caveat of being sustainable as well. Just because we can create 1,000 calorie deficit today doesn't mean we can sustain it. So we can use rapid weight loss approaches early on, but if we're going to do that, we need to make sure we're eating our protein and we need to make sure that we're going to have our strength training. Now, our performance might suffer a little bit initially, but there's always this health performance trade-off at this point, where it's like if someone's very overweight, we might put them on a more aggressive deficit because of the psychological benefits of having some momentum moving forwards. Like if someone struggles to lose weight and they're losing weight quite quickly, that can be quite motivating. But that does come with the caveat of if people have, hunger dysregulation, they might not be able to sustain that deficit because they're just too damn hungry. So what approach we use is going to be determined by the starting point of the person, that's in terms of their training experience, right? The starting point of the person in terms of the amount of hunger and behavioral elements they've got which regulate their eating, so how aggressive we can be. And then the third thing really is going to be again how much body fat we have to start with. Okay, now just because we have high body fat doesn't mean we can necessarily be more aggressive. Just because we have low body fat doesn't mean we can't be more aggressive at the start if we are willing to sacrifice some training strength at the start of it. So if we want the best of both worlds, what I've talked about here, we have to have this interchange and this interplay. So finally, just in this quick last 5 minutes, I wish I'd done more time for this now because it's quite a lot to get through. I've done these little faint little arrows here, which again, just are there to highlight the relationships between these two things and how they can influence. So for example, if we've got an aggressive energy balance, we're going to be likely to have a lower carb diet because we're going to reduce some carbohydrates, right? To increase that calorie deficit. Chances are that's going to have an effect on our recovery on our performance in our central nervous system. Our body fat percentage is linked to our central nervous system because there's regulators of our body fat mass. If our body fat gets too low, that is going to tell our nervous system we're in a low energy state. And that's going to cause us to feel more fatigued, more tired. There's a direct correlation between those two things there, and other hormones like leptin and hunger regulating hormones as well, which are going to have a significant impact on our performance potentially in the gym anyway. In terms of body fat percentage and muscle growth, so I've got a line here. There's an obvious one there. If we're in a low body fat state, we're likely to also have low levels of hormones that are going to promote muscle gain and muscle growth. Doesn't mean we're not going to be able to grow it, but at some point, those scales, our body fat's going to get to a level of low body fat. We're not going to be able to efficiently grow muscle anymore. And that's where a lot of people struggle. They're like, I've got aesthetic as I want to be. I want to get stronger. We might have to accept that we need to increase a little bit of fat mass initially to get stronger. One, because mass helps move mass, which creates more mechanical tension, which is a stimulus for muscle growth. Okay. And on the other side of it as well, it might just be like it creates a healthier, I hate using terms like this because it's a bit vague, but it paints the picture, a healthier metabolic environment for muscle growth. Okay. So there comes a point which we might have to accept we need to gain a little bit of fat mass to gain a little bit of strength. For the reasons I also discussed before, if we're a powerlifter or a pure strength athlete, it reduces range of motion. There's other things in the muscle as well that can change like the shape of a muscle overall. So you get different pull of actions of muscles to make them more efficient. There's loads of different things like that, again, which is outside the scope of what I'm talking about. But again, Chris Beardsley does a lot of stuff on that. I think it's Chris A. Beardsley on Instagram if you're tuning in this late. Really good. Really good information on that sort of stuff as well. And then there's obviously a link between muscle size and aesthetics, okay? So again, this pulls us back to the kind of program that we should really be doing, which again, for the best of both worlds, you're looking at that kind of 5 rep range on that cusp of hypertrophy and strength that ticks the best of both worlds because that's what we're here for. And the next thing that we need to focus on then the final thing we need to focus on then is how we piece all that together for our approach here. And that comes down to a bit of trial and error. It comes down to understanding yourself as an individual and going, look, what level of deficit can I sustain? And then being a positive thing, right? Let's view things positively. If you can only sustain a small deficit, okay, you have to be more accurate. And it's not fair that we need to be more moderated with our food intake, okay? If we can only sustain a small deficit, but it does mean that we've got more energy to train, right? So that's the win. If we can sustain a greater deficit, okay, are we willing to potentially sacrifice some recovery and some training output because of that, which means we might limit strength? There's always a trade-off here. It's just what trade-off works best for us and where our mindset is at any given time. So one of the things that I've done finally is an example program that is part of my like membership area. This is the what's it called? What do you have it? Like, this is the timeshare part of the presentation where I try and get people to buy into it, right? So basically, like, one of the things that I took this idea of reps in reserve before, like having 1 or 2 reps in the tank. So basically on a strength program here, these are all self-programmable. So I've got 2-day-a-week program, 3-day-a-week program, 4-day-a-week program. For beginners, I'd always say start with 2 days a week. There's a lot more volume involved in those sessions. Like you can see here, I've got those sort of 6 rep ranges. Again, strength hypertrophy rep range is 5, 6-ish. I've chosen 6 for a reason. What's about here? And then again, for those isolated movements, I like those 15 reps just because it allows a little bit more concentration on the muscle, a little bit more kind of like ability to focus and create that idea called a mind-muscle connection, okay? I would always say start with a 2-day-a-week program. Again, full body 2-day-a-week. Then you can go to a 3-day-a-week program where you then start to mix things up between like an upper body, a lower body, and then an upper body session. And then a 4-day-a-week program where you can do like upper, lower, upper, basically. But what you're not going to do is just jump straight in at a 4-day-a-week program. Start with your minimal effective dose. You don't want to fill up your volume cup and how much training you can handle too quickly. So start it with 2 days a week. Increase the number of reps, increase the number of sets. So you could even change this up to, these are all fully customizable to yourself as well. So you could do, for example, on this exercise here, just to go to the exercise library. So on the exercise library, I've got examples of every single one of those movements there. So you can program it for your home gym, program it for the gym that you're in. And then there's an outlink here as well to a website which has got all the descriptions for all the exercises on it if you're not sure with technical descriptions. So you can do your own program dependent on what kit you've got available, which is why these are very vague terms here, but you could add an extra setting. But basically how this works in terms of auto adjustment is, I don't know, I've put 100 kilos there. My reps in reserve on week 1 is 3. So the next week the load stays the same. The next week the load goes up because I've got more reps in reserve. If that was 1, for example, I'm too close to near failure, so the load would stay the same. So these programs auto adjust over time. If this is confusing, I'm not going to go through it now because it's all on the website if you are interested in this, or if anyone wants to have a chat with me about the programs and how they work specifically, then drop me an email, a message, or whatever. And so from this, these programs kind of auto regulate up so that when you've got enough reps in reserve, then the program will progress. So we don't accumulate a lot of unnecessary fatigue, which means that, yes, we might have the same weight for a few weeks, but with time, particularly with a calorie deficit, those things get a little bit easier. And then obviously as part of the membership area as well, there's like full nutrition support, access to my nutrition app. And obviously the component of this, which there's loads of apps out there that do this, by the way, loads of apps out there. But on a Monday evening, what we do is we have the opportunity to go through and have a group coaching session where if someone is saying like, look, I'm stuck at this weight for this number of reps, for this number of sets, we can log on, share the spreadsheet, and I can talk through and say, okay, well, what we might do is say, look, this week, we're going to drop this to 3. Oh, that's the wrong keyboard. My friend's keyboard, not the right one. It's like pressing the keyboard, it's the wrong one. We might do 3 and we might go to 4 sets there. And then we will then change the load and go up from that position there. So these are all variables you can manipulate, which you can learn for yourself. The information's out there. And I've not even got into programming really today because it's more about the principles rather than the programming. Because if you understand the principles well enough, the programming, kind of occurs as a sideline to that. So in summary, and just, where's it gone? Back to my PowerPoint. In summary, basically, there's an interplay between calorie deficit and strength, but you can get strong whilst losing body fat. I would always suggest starting with a pragmatic approach and playing the long game in terms of both your strength development, small progressions in training frequency, in training load, and number of sets. So start with that sort of 3 sets of 3 to 5 reps on an exercise for pure strength. But if you want to build some muscle, then between 5 and 15 is a good place to be. And then, add in an extra set, then add in an extra day. But, as long as you're progressing something, whether it's reps, sets, or loads, you'll be winning. I just think that's the most pragmatic way to do it. If you're not getting stronger, take a week off every few weeks to resensitize the muscle. There's a hypothesis there that's worth exploring and something that I find helps me. I'll do 4 weeks strength training, then take a week of easier training or do something else. Remember that we can create a calorie deficit, which is quite significant for some people if they can sustain it, which will mean that we lose fat quickly or fat quicker, but it means that we're likely to also have some fatigue, which affects our training. Is that a trade-off we're willing to have? Who knows? That's your judgment call. We're all big boys and big girls here. We can pull on our big boys and big girl pants and make our own decisions on that. And then we monitor the data. We track our weight, we track our performance using a spreadsheet, using a chart, using an app, whatever it might be. And then we just say, okay, am I happy with this level of progression? And that's the point. We can maximize strength relative to our body composition, but we can't maximize strength and have an entirely aesthetic physique. We can also get as strong as we want and potentially maximize our strength potential, but the chances are we're never going to have the level of aesthetics that we want unless we want like a proper power belly, okay? So again, that's the trade-off. So I would always say, try and aim at relative strength. That's what I'm doing now. I want to be as strong as I can and at a level of aesthetics that I can. So I'm not really bothered about doing loads of high volume bodybuilding type training at the moment. I do some fluff because, you can never have too big a biceps, right? That's the rules of the playground. Bigger arms, the better. But most of my training is done in that 3 to 5 rep ranges. I'm training for a powerlifting competition now. So it's 1 to 5 because I have to do some heavier stuff there as well, because there is a difference in terms of handling those heavier loads. But for most people, 3 to 5 reps is perfectly fine for pure strength. If you're not interested in, developing muscle growth, at the same time. Just remember, though, that the energy and energy outbalance thing is going to require some extra activity. So what I would say is a final thing and a point I meant to touch upon is that extra activity. You don't want to be doing loads of like high intensity interval training or like really hard endurance runs if you want to get maximally strong, because that's going to create fatigue in the central nervous system. I knew there was something there that I meant to cover. That's going to create extra fatigue in your body, which is then going to affect your ability to produce maximum force. Now, if that's what you need to do because you enjoy doing that kind of training, that's fine, but you're probably never going to maximize your strength at the same relative deficit. So again, lower intensity cardio burns less calories on a per minute basis, but tends to cause less fatigue than doing like endurance type stuff or HIIT type stuff. But what I would say is that if you are going to do that, then separate those sessions out or do them at the end of the session, so you've got plenty of time to recover between your strength sessions. So again, if you're going to do cardio and strength in one session, either do them in separate sessions as far apart as possible, like morning or evening, or do them at the end of a session, do some interval work, and then leave as long as you can between your next strength session. So let's say you did a bench press session on a Monday evening, and then you did some intervals afterwards. Try not to do like your next strength workout the next day if it can be helped. But the overall, all of this, at the heart of all this is, you kind of have to make this fit with your lifestyle as well. You know, we have to balance our lifestyle within all of this. So maximizing and optimizing is only as useful as it is for our ability to, you know, have a normal balanced life. But what we can do is take the absolute principles of maximizing and say, okay, if I can get to like 80% of that and 80% of the time be as consistent as I can, you know, and I'm happy to have a little bit of extra fatigue, which might minimize or not minimize, limit my strength gains because I want to do some extra cardio because it's important. And by the way, I still promote cardio for strength athletes, just because I think it's good for being healthy is at the heart of everything that I do. And also it can help with managing fatigue and recovery and things as well. Having a good aerobic base will still help with strength. By having a good aerobic base, I don't mean running ultra marathons or anything like that. I just mean being moderately fit, doing some cardiovascular exercise, at least, you know, a couple of days a week would be beneficial. Doesn't have to be hard taxing stuff, but just, you know, a brisk walk or something like that would be beneficial to a lot of people, I think. So yeah, that's all I have to say about that. And that's where I'm going to leave it for today. What I'm probably going to do is do other workshops where I dig into each one of these in a little bit more detail. This was very much meant to be an overview. And yeah, so like I said, in summary, strength and aesthetics can coexist, but there's always going to be a limit to those things. And there's always going to be a limit to how much we can gain strength with fat loss for both central and general mass size, muscle growth, and body fat issues as well. Right, you wonderful humans. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully that's been moderately useful. If some of that went over your head, don't worry. Don't feel free to drop me an email. You've all got my email address. Ask questions if there's anything that needs tidying up. I'm going to rewatch this now anyway and see if there's anything I've misspoke on for any clarification before I post it anyway. And I, at that note, will bid you guys good night. Any questions before we go? We good? Only a few people will turn up. I'll send the links. Right, you wonderful humans. Have a good rest of your evening. See you later. I'm going to fist bump everybody. Bye. This is my new thing now. I'm going to fist bump everybody. That's you, Emma. That's you, Blaze. See you later, guys. Bye.